We're going to continue our conversation on World War I. Today we're going to talk about the United States entering the war. Okay? Why did they enter the war? What happened when they did? What did it take for us to enter a world war? When war broke out in Europe in 1914, the U.S. remained neutral, which means they did not support either side. The country was deeply divided about the war, as many of its citizens had recently arrived from Europe and were strongly in favor of one side or the other. When German U-boats, which were submarines we talked about last time, started to sink American ships, however, public opinion began to turn against Germany. In February of 1917, 3 years after the start of the war, Germany decided to attack all foreign shipping to try to reduce supplies to Britain. It also tried to encourage Mexico to invade the U.S. from the south, in an attempt to turn U.S. attention away from the war in Europe. This action angered the U.S. government, and as more U.S. ships were sunk, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, decided to take action. On April 7, 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, turning the war into a truly global conflict. Now, what were the events that took place that drew America into the war? Let's look at that a little bit closer. In February of 1915, the Germans announced they would wage unrestricted submarine warfare on the waters around Great Britain. That meant the German Navy intended to attack both military and non-military vessels, like freighters and tankers. In April of 1915, they issued notices of their intention in newspapers in Britain and across Europe, and even in the United States. 50 notices were placed in American newspapers on April 22, 2015, warning Americans of possible danger should they sail on British ships or any other of their allied ships. I believe that was a typo on this website. It said 2015. That should be 1915. So the notices were placed on the newspapers in April 22nd of 1915. Warning Americans that there is possible danger if they sail on the British ships. On May 7th of 1915, the British luxury passenger liner, the Lusitania, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland by a submerged German U-boat. The Lusitania sunk in 18 minutes, and of the 48 lifeboats on board, only 6 were successfully launched. Over 1,000 people died. The death toll included over 100 Americans who were passengers on the Lusitania. The outcry was heard around the world. To attack an unarmed passenger ship was against international law. But Woodrow Wilson refused to declare war on Germany in 1915 over the sinking of the Lusitania. He believed it was not strong enough reason to risk many thousands of American lives should the United States enter the war effort against Germany. However, combined with other actions over the next 2 years, the sinking of the Lusitania did help to tip the U.S. into joining the war effort in 1917. Great Britain used the sinking of the Lusitania as propaganda, presenting the German people as monsters. War propaganda, in a nutshell, is things like posters or little write-ups or things like that that will have an influence on the people. The influence they may have is, we want to join the war. We want you guys to sign up for the war, or things like that. We want to paint Germany as monsters. Or with the Germans, they may have propaganda that paints the U.S. or Great Britain as monsters. Essentially, it's anything that has an intention to influence the people. So, for instance, a good example nowadays would be commercials. Whenever you watch TV, you see commercials getting you to buy something. Well, the whole intention of that is to persuade you on something. So you may not get an unbiased view of a product of toothpaste or anything like that. No, if there's a toothpaste commercial, you're getting influenced by that company, that theirs is the best. So that's what, whenever you hear propaganda, especially when you hear war propaganda, that's what it's referring to. Usually posters hung up around that are trying to influence population one way or the other. In this case, it was to get involved in the war. Okay. The British even circulated a rumor that German school kids received the day off to celebrate the sinking of the Lusitania. Posters appeared all over Britain. Remember the Lusitania. And these particular posters didn't use pictures, they used text and color to present a fact that the Germans had been tried and found to be evil murderers, and it was very effective. Many men enlisted in the army because of this, and the cry, "Remember the Lusitania," was heard all over Britain. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how this influenced our government and our president to finally declare war on Germany. On April 2nd of 1917, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson met with a joint session of U.S. Congress. He requested that a declaration of war be made against the Central Powers, and this request was a long time coming. The war in Europe had started in 1914, and the Germans had sunk the passenger ship Lusitania in 1915 with over 100 American passengers on board. Again, what we've just been talking about, Germany was conducting unrestricted submarine warfare. Their U-boats were sinking these ships, and he had asked Congress to let him arm some of these ships that were going to be in that area, just in case they see some more of those U-boats. And he did arm some of them. In April 1917, Congress finally agreed to come into the war on the side of the Allies. So it took 3 years after the start of the war till we became a part of the war. So why did it take America so long to join the war effort? Nobody wanted to get involved. Not the American public, not the U.S. Congress, not the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. But America was affected by the war. American industry realized great profit through the production and sale of tanks, bullets, uniforms, and other materials needed to fight the war. And Americans were greatly affected by the war propaganda posters. Germany was worried because of potentially increased profits and effective war propaganda that the U.S. might join the war effort on the side of the Allies. Germany knew that if America entered the war, Germany would be in trouble, and they were tired. They had been fighting a bloody war for 3 years. They did not want a new enemy, especially not one with a strong army. Germany sent a telegram to their representative in Mexico. This telegram became known as the Zimmermann telegram. This telegram directed their representative, Zimmermann, to work in secret negotiation with Mexican officials to get Mexico to agree to declare war on the U.S., if the U.S. declared war on Germany. And Germany was willing to make many concessions. Make many concessions means give them something in return. They offered Mexico land and money. After all, Mexico had been at war with the U.S. before in the Mexican-American War, a war that ended in 1848 with an American victory. This time, with Germany's help, Mexico could get back in the territory they had lost in the war. But Mexico said no. The Zimmermann telegram was intercepted by the British in January 1917, and the British did not want to immediately share this telegram with the U.S. There had been talk between Britain and the U.S. about a possible American entry into the war, but nothing had been firmed. Britain was also concerned that America would not enter the war if they thought Mexico might create a conflict along the U.S.-Mexican border. But they did finally share it with the president. And when the president released this telegram to the U.S. press, it was published in the newspapers. Americans never take threats well, so the contents of this telegram swayed public opinion against Germany. By April 6th of that year, 1917, Congress had approved Wilson's request to declare war. All right, so as of right now in history, the year 2020, America has one of the strongest militaries in the world. It wasn't always that way. Let's talk about what what our military looked like at this time and how this war changed our military forever. By February 1917, the U.S. was on the verge of war, though the country was almost totally unprepared. The U.S. military had 133,000 men in the U.S. Army, only 600 pieces of field artillery, less than 500 machine guns, no tanks, no steel helmets, no gas protection equipment. With almost no heavy artillery pieces, a small air service, and only a handful of camps that could be used for training, the country quickly mobilized for the war effort. Congress appropriated money for military affairs and shouted down members who opposed the war. Newspapers were filled with stories of preparing for war, recruiting an army, and converting industries to war production. It was a race against time, as one headline reported. Germany planned to whip allies before the U.S. is ready. So the Germans knew that the U.S. would be ready, we would have a strong army, but at the time, we weren't there yet. And they wanted to whip the Allies before we could prepare fully for this. After entering World War I, the U.S. had to build training camps for millions of new recruits. One soldier described Fort Sheridan, Illinois, as somewhat like a college campus on the eve of a big game. Training, however, was deadly serious. 800 British and French combat veterans came to the U.S. to prepare troops for the Western Front. The new recruits struggled to keep their heads down while crawling under barbed wire. They plunged bayonets into straw dummies with Fritz written on them. They learned they had 7 seconds to put on a gas mask. The Army also needed thousands of officers. Regular Army and National Guard officers were quickly promoted. The creation of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, converted college students with military aptitude into leaders. On May 26, 1917, Major General John J. Pershing was promoted as Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Forces, referred to as AEF. The order gave Pershing command over all the land forces of the United States, operating in continental Europe and the UK, including any parts of the Marine Corps which may be detached for service there with the Army. The newly created AEF would cooperate with the forces of the other countries, and the order stated, but as a separate and distinct component of the combined forces. Within 1 year of declaring war, the U.S. had assembled a military force of nearly 4 million men and women. The American Expeditionary Forces, combined with units from the regular Army, Marines, various state and national guards, nationalized by the federal government, and the new National Army created from volunteers and draftees. The regular Army units and Marines had existed before the war, but were now expanded with the influx of volunteers. 2 million troops would eventually be at the Western Front, serving in the Army and the Marines, and another 200,000 naval personnel were in European waters. Let's talk a brief moment about General John J. Pershing, the man who was in charge of these new armies that were going over to Europe. So, General Pershing faced many challenges as the U.S. Standing Army swelled from slightly less than 130,000 men to 2 million in just 18 months. He had to make many decisions, such as how large it should grow, how to organize supplies, and how they should fight in Europe. He also needed to decide whether or not to lend American soldiers to the European allies. He believed that strategy would not work because one moment. When the AF arrived in Europe, the Allies were exhausted from 3 years of war. While some American military personnel and European allies wanted Pershing to send American troops to fill in the gaps, he established his authority by refusing to do so. He believed the strategy would not work because the training methods used by the U.S. and the Europeans were too different from each other. He also thought the united American military force would hurt the Germans' morale more. Despite opposition, Pershing stood firm in his decision. So what it was Pershing did not want to send his troops to merely fill in the gaps where the Allies needed. He went over there, he helped the Allies with the U.S. Army, but he also maintained control of it. So we were operating as a U.S. Army, but we were also helping them as well. So essentially he thought that would be a better way to influence the war rather than just saying, hey, we got soldiers over here, put them wherever you want them. But it ended up working because we ended up winning the war. And we ended up also creating a military that, 4 million men and women in the military, and we became, that was our first time doing that. So with this pivotal historic event, the modern American Army was born in World War I. Approximately 4 million men would end up serving in the U.S. Armed Forces from April 6, 1917 to November 11, 1918. The World War I effort definitely helped bolster the American Army to where it is today. Until next time.